David Frawley is one of the greatest scholars of our times. And he has made India proud. He has looked at the essence of what India is, and in fact awakened. He has shown us the beauty of our own culture, for which we are not only grateful, but we bow down to you. Thank you so much for this wonderful thing that you have done, enlightening us. With this, the topic of today is Sri Aurobindo, not only for India, but for the whole of humanity. And that is something so relevant to the celebration of the 150th year of Sri Aurobindo's anniversary. I have a background of Ma, which means we dedicate everything to the Divine Mother. Thank you.
Namaste, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. I'm very happy and also very honored to be with you here in Pondicherry itself, in the proximity to where Sri Aurobindo spent so much time and had so much of his meditation and realization. I was actually born in 1950, which was the year, of course, he took his Mahasamadhi. And I cannot claim to speak for Sri Aurobindo or for any of the organizations around him, but I can simply share my thoughts or inspirations or whatever comes up about this. And essentially, I've been studying Sri Aurobindo's teachings since 1970. And also, he served to open many dimensions to me. I had previously studied the yoga and also the Vedanta and some other factors. But through his life divine, he had these little quotes on from Vedas, particularly Rig Veda, at the beginning of the chapters. And that gradually drew me into study of Rig Veda itself and his Secret of the Vedas and hymns to the mystic fire. And presently, what we're doing relative to Aurobindo, actually not even specific to Aurobindo itself, is setting up what we call the Secret of the Vedas educational project, which will be both classroom-based and also online-based to expand that tradition and teaching and knowledge. Because as Sri Aurobindo was able to so rightly show, is that the Veda is the root of the Indian civilization, and it is our most reliable and ancient record of the great rishis and sages. You know, we have progressed quite a bit in terms of science and technology, but in terms of higher consciousness, we still look back to our more ancient books and teachings. And some of our modern thinkers, I would put the psychologist in here, seem to be breeding more confusion in the human mind than the enlightenment or self-realization. So he opened that door for me and went into a number of dimensions and other teachings. And very interesting experience is that I had written some translation studies of Vedas and Upanishads as just an independent thinker. In fact, I was in my 20s. And M.P. Pandit happened to be coming through the region where I was. So I took my manuscripts to him and showed it to him. And he was very helpful. In fact, he said to me he would start publishing these things in India through the Sri Aurobindo Ashram. And that was a tremendous affirmation because I was an independent young person going against academia without any other direct support. So that brought about the inspiration for me to bring out my work, starting in the India context, but then also in the West, and expanding into the broader Vedic sciences, Yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, and Jyotish, etc., ancient India. And curiously, the publisher we ended up working with, Lotus Press, was the publisher who was doing Sri Aurobindo's works in the United States. Anyway, so we came in through that, and the basis of my work was always to bring things back to the Vedas, not necessarily in an Indian context, but certainly in the context of the ancient history and ancient humanity overall. All the ancient, it's very interesting, all the ancient civilizations in the world, whether it's Egypt, Sumeria, Mexico, Peru, China, India, none of them said we were the first. They all talked about the great sages and civilizations that existed before them. But of course the academics have thrown that out because they can't seem to find the evidence for that. So there is another deeper spiritual rishi yogi basis of humanity, civilization, and the evolution of consciousness. One of the most brilliant insights Sri Aurobindo gave was redefining evolution as an evolution of consciousness, not in the Darwinian sense as an evolution of bodies. How can a body evolve without consciousness? And then also it's sort of like, an animal makes tracks when it moves, and if you're going after what the body does, the evolution of the body, you're looking at the tracks. Who is actually making the tracks? Evolution of consciousness, and also evolution of a higher intelligence. And this is something that all the yogic teachings, Vedic teachings, teach us, is that we are not intelligent. We all know, if we look at the human world, that we're not terribly intelligent. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many problems as we have throughout history. But the human mind is largely a conditioned, karmic, pranic, and compulsive response. It is not self-aware. And it is not capable of making direct perception or individual insights. It relies upon information, ideas, language, and education from the outside. And its main purpose is proper functioning in the particular society in which we happen to be born. So what's going on now is there has been in society an evolution of technology, not necessarily an evolution of intelligence or even creativity. Even for art, we look back in time to the older historical productions, not to what is going on specifically today. And on top of that, we've had a major development of technology. And this is something very interesting for someone like me. I'm born in 1950, in the middle of what we used to call the 20th century. And what we see now is the technology is moving more in 10 years than it did in 50 years before that, or some decades before that. And the nature of our technology is so rapidly changing that people cannot keep up with it if they are older. And if they're younger, they're just being controlled or moved or changed by the technology. So what kind of intelligence do we have? What kind of consciousness are we evolving? And what is the role of the great yogic and Vedic teachings in that context, and specifically Sri Aurobindo? And this is very important because we are standing at a certain crossroads. The problem, recently I was looking through one of Yogananda's books, And he made an interesting statement. He says, we've advanced into an electrical age beyond the old, non-mechanical eras we're in. But he says, science is always a two-edged sword. It develops a new technology that can help us, but then we also weaponize the technology. So our technology is being weaponized as fast as, or even faster than it is being developed. And so we don't have any sense of security. And then the technology is affecting and changing, improving to a great extent our outer functions. You can travel very quickly now. You have access to so much information. But there is not a development of wisdom or compassion or insight. In fact, we are making our world more mechanical. For example, our medicine is becoming chemical. We see human being as a chemical function, the brain, not as a conscious being, or not as an independent agent able to make decisions about life. And in this context, we see a lot of decay or cultural collapse in the Western world. For example, Europe has lost most of its traditions. Of course, you have refugees and other factors as well going on. But at the level of culture, there's been a movement away from the artistic mind or creative expression into this mechanical form. And even in a country like the United States, we have tremendous division, and we have we could almost say, borderline collapse in academia and in the university system. People are getting through the university system based upon political correctness, even though they may not be able to pass a test or have any original ideas. So it's a very simple matter. Unless we develop a higher awareness, consciousness, self-awareness, discriminating insight, what the Vedas call viveka, it's going to be very hard for us to move forward. Around the beginning of the 20th century, this book came out of Samuel Huntington, which they called The Clash of Civilizations, how you had these different civilization areas, including India was one, Europe, Islamic world, etc. Now we're coming into what I call the self-destruction of civilizations. They're not even something from the outside, something from the inside is not there in order to sustain it. And then we as human beings are losing the sense of who we are, where we're going, and what is the meaning of life. We have more information than ever, but information is not knowledge, and how you process it, what it means, and where it leads you is another matter. We're talking about artificial intelligence. If you talk about an artificial human being is not a real human being. And we're losing our connection with nature, and even with our own individual nature. We've lost connections with who we are and what our body is. So essentially, the crisis is in consciousness, and it requires developing a higher consciousness, a crisis in intelligence. True intelligence is a power of original thought and direct perception. It's not a matter of looking things up in a book or on a computer or repeating what someone has told us. We have to make original decisions in life. We have this concept of dharma. In fact, the Hindu tradition, Sanatana Dharma. Sri Aurobindo also says it's Veda's foundation. Sanatana Dharma is the foundational knowledge for humanity. But what is Dharma? Dharma requires doing what is best possible at any given moment. That is the first thing. But as you know in life, there may be something best possible, but almost every option seems to have some problems that go along with it. I mean, we can see that specifically relative to Mahabharata. They had to make decisions when there was no ideal solution. But if you don't make a decision, then the negative forces take over. And then we also have the concept of karma and karma yoga. And that is also, karma yoga is, again, you do what is the best possible, and your action is an offering to the highest. It's not that you don't seek the result of action. You seek the best possible result of action, but not personally for yourself, but as an offering to the divine. And Sri Aurobindo had made that point. Now, if you look at Sri Aurobindo's life, he also came at a very crucial time, beginning of the 20th century, and he had followed only a few years after Swami Vivekananda. He also knew Sister Nivedita, and he was one of the leaders of the Indian independence movement. We like to recommend Sanjeev Sanil's book, The Revolutionaries, because that explains the role of Sri Aurobindo in that particular approach. Some people say Sri Aurobindo had a political phase and then he went into a spiritual phase, but actually they were always both the same, in the sense that he was looking for a greater development of humanity, and he understood the older, what we call the Kshatriya Dharma. In fact, he had always made the statement that a country needs to be led by a Kshatriya. Renunciate cannot lead the country. That's not that the renunciation is wrong, but it's a different type of value system and action that is required. So his view of civilization, and more specifically in India or Bharat, is quite different than the Gandhian model. Of course, there were also some disagreements there. I don't want to go into that. But we do have Sri Aurobindo went back to Ramayana, Mahabharata, and he understood the way the human life and society works. And he also understood the nature of the civilization. So it was very clear. The new India, the independent India, needed to be a strong country, strong in terms of national identity, economically, politically, foreign policy, militarily, culturally, and spiritually. And this was the old model that you had during the classical phase they used to call of India's civilization. Remember that for example, take Indonesia. You go back in the Indonesian language 2,000 years, the oldest script is in Brahmi, and almost half the words are Sanskrit loan words. And you also have that same movement of civilization throughout Asia. And the idea of a civilization based upon meditation, self-realization, yoga, honoring of nature, and the cosmic vision, not simply a human vision, and the sense of universal consciousness, not just simply human mind. So essentially, human mind is what we call embodied consciousness. In fact, the human life is what we call embodied prana. But consciousness is a universal force in everything. So the non-embodied consciousness, that is where the yoga goes, moving beyond body and mind as you, not giving up body and mind, using them as instruments for a higher consciousness. So what Sri Aurobindo has been able to give us is an understanding of a deeper intelligence, an evolution of consciousness, and a way of dealing with the material world to expand into a higher evolution for humanity. You can't give up the technology. At the same time, if you do not have a detached and discerning awareness to deal with the technology, it will overwhelm you. And in this regard, you see the technology has a electrical force, right? Essentially, it's a drug. It becomes a drug. You get stimulated from the outside, and then you get dependent upon that. And so what's happening with the technology, take in the case of children, they're getting plugged into a phone. They're getting limited into a little box and losing depth perception, losing space, losing the wider aspect because we're not cultivating the awareness to master the technology. Sri Aurobindo kind of saw that in advance. In fact, a number of the discoveries in neuropsychology, etc., he also had seen those or predicted those before that, and also understanding this universal force of consciousness. So that is what we need to do, but how do we do it? And there he has a deep understanding, and also how do we connect to the Shakti, or the universal force. You know, Shakti in Sanskrit is often called Vidyut, lightning, electricity. Tadi, even Kundalini, they say prana. It's an electrical type force, but it's a force of consciousness, not simply a material or electromagnetic force in the outer sense of the term. So we are in that dilemma today where we need to change education, starting with ourselves, and we need to develop a deeper insight, consciousness, discernment, intelligence. And that is particularly daunting because it's interesting, Upanishads say that we have the five senses that draw us outward, so it's hard for us to turn within. We not only have five senses, we have 100 different devices that are pulling our awareness outward, and we then have a greater concern about the outer world, and we do not have an awareness or perception of the inner world. And the generation coming up is now moving into what we call virtual reality, which of course virtual reality is also virtual unreality, or it's a type of Maya. And so what is happening is, even for the young people, their virtual image is more important than who they are. So they will discipline their body and mind, or even surgically make changes in order to have the proper virtual image they think that they need to have. So yoga is first of all about self-awareness, but that is necessary to connect to the more cosmic Shakti, the mother force. Mother Nature also has the power of evolution. It is inherent in the force of nature herself. And nature is not just Mother Earth. Mother Earth is a very important part of that. But it's always said that Shakti dwells in infinite space. Space, solitude. There is a Vidyut Shakti, or a lightning force that is pervading all of space. And out of that comes the vibratory energies of light, sound, and of course pranava, mantra, which is the basis of the cosmic law. That is why yoga is essentially based upon and follows the mantra yoga. Even if we look back to Yoga Sutras, it says the Adiguru of yoga is Ishvara. Ishvara means the inherent self-awareness in the universe. And his vachaka, his indicator, he or she, it's not actually a gender issue, is pranava or om. So in other words, that force of cosmic intelligence is there and resounding and developing. And one thing Sri Aurobindo was, of course, was a very great poet and kavi. He talked about the future poetry. How do we bring that pranava in to change the structure of our nervous system? How do we bring that specific Shakti in? And how do we develop evolution not only as an individual force, but in the society as a whole? Now, what is happening in India today is there is a major cultural and civilizational change going on. The specific event is, of course, the Ram Janmabhoomi temple, but that's just a manifestation of energies that have been coming out all along. A very sad thing happened. When India received its independence in 1947, the thinkers, and almost the generation that led the new India, was not the thinkers that brought about the independence movement. And they were actually more aligned to a British and colonial mentality. So figures like Sri Aurobindo, Tagore, going all the way back to Tilak, Swami Vivekananda, were put in the background. And of course we have the socialist, leftist, British influence continued. And in that context, there was an attempt to move away from that deeper yogic tradition and create India as a modern nation state along European models. Of course, we know the European nation states have been in perpetual wars. World War I, World War II, Ukraine War, we're not going to go into that, but they did not have a model for peace and happiness. So there was then this background sense of non-fulfillment that India had not received its intellectual, cultural, or spiritual independence. And after partitioning the country in the favor of Islam, which became Pakistan and then later Bangladesh, not a single temple was given back to the Hindus, not even Ram Janmabhoomi. And Sardar Patel was able to take Somnath back, but that was not accepted by Nehru and the rest. So instead of the model of India that Sri Aurobindo had, we had the Nehruvian model. I don't want to go into its limitations in that regard, but I want to remember there was this, what was it called, Bhavani Bharati, where he also talked about how the Asuric forces would be coming after India, particularly from the area of Bengal and the area of Kerala, relative to destabilize those influences. So now there has been a decisive change and a new look to Sri Aurobindo. And again, we have the 150th anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and also 75th of India's independence movement. And we now have a lot of the thinkers and people working at educational and government levels looking to Sri Aurobindo's teaching and saying this is a much better model. I don't want to criticize anyone, but if you put Gandhi on your money, that's not a very good way to bring Mahalakshmi into your society. Again, I'm not going against anybody, but if you look at what is necessary, you do need to have that Kshatriya force. India has always honored Lakshmi, Saraswati, as well as Devi in all of her forms. So it's a very transitional era. And it's very interesting because today, India is the only country in the world that's undergoing a positive cultural renaissance, going back actually to a tradition that's over 5,000 years old. The United States tradition is only a couple, 200-300 years old, and it's also undergoing loss. And Europe as well. Europe under the colonial era basically ruled most of the world, and yet today they're losing their own traditions, art, music, culture, identity. So there is a vacuum created, and we now need to bring that higher evolution of consciousness and the development. Sri Aurobindo uses the term supramental, but essentially, again, mind is not in itself intelligent. That is the basic view, for example, of all the Indian systems of knowledge. You go back to Sankhya, for example, Manas Chitta is part of Prakriti. It's part of an external conditioning. And even if we look at the Yoga Sutras is developing samadhi. And for that you need the viveka, the discernment, and vairagya. Detachment, which is detached awareness, detached perception. So new educational model, cultural model, these things are required. So we do see that India today has a new resurgence of interest in Sri Aurobindo, and in a slightly different light. In this case, it's also Aurobindo, like a number of the other leaders, talked about return to the Vedas. Remember, Sri Aurobindo did his Himsa, the Mystic Fire, but we also had the return to the Vedas. Tilak also had that. Even you go back to Arya Samaj, also had that. The main book of the independence movement was the Bhagavad Gita. It was not the main book of the post-independence movement. That was another. And then the yoga, and Vivekananda brought the yoga globally, and Sri Aurobindo has also kept that going in a very vast, the idea of an integral or more synthetic yoga that is addressing all aspects of the human being and all aspects of our nature, because we have forgotten all the entire universe dwells within you. That is the understanding, the Dhara Vidya in the Upanishads, and so forth. And so we have those inner potentials, but we don't have the people to teach them. And in the other parts of the world, we don't necessarily have the understanding at a cultural level. And this is not a matter of what we would call religion. Religion in the outer sense is a belief system, which is a certain set of ideas and emotions and feelings, but it is not necessarily insight or knowledge. What we need is what I like to call experiential spirituality at an individual level, or sadhana. You have a sadhana tradition in India, not one of saying, Jesus said, somebody said, and you're saved. There's no self-realization by proxy. If there was, it would be self-realization for the other person, not for you. It wouldn't be of much benefit for you in the process. So in other words, the value of these teachings is more relevant globally and more honored specifically in the India context, and an ability to work with science. Science has its place, but science deals with the outer. We always have that very famous Upanishadic statement, para apara vidya, that the outer knowledge is name, form, and number. That helps you, what we call the Vedanta, also called the Vyavaharika Satya, the outer truth. It helps you deal with the outer world, where to go, what jobs to do, how to deal with your technology, but it cannot tell you who you are or what is the nature of reality. For that you need the inner knowledge, the akshara, the immortal, the eternal, and the self-knowledge, the atma vidya. Even in, you see in a lot of the texts, they talk about avidya, or ignorance. That avidya is a lack of the inner knowledge, the lack of the atma vidya. Some of the most ignorant people in the world are intellectuals. I'm not saying that as an intellectual, I don't like to be called one, but some people call me one anyway. But the point I'm raising there is that someone has an inherent ignorance and arrogance to what we call, we like to call it the rajasic buddhi. And that dominates in academia, politics, media, because the ego is the basis of the human mind. So the first function of the human mind is to protect the body, to protect your position in society, and to help you expand in the material world. That is our outer being. So we have this higher knowledge beyond name, form, and number. Sri Aurobindo also explains that samadhi very well as knowledge by identity, not knowledge by seeing something on the outside. Whatever you see is also within you, but it's not that you are that object. You share a common being and consciousness with that. But you know, we have so many universities throughout the world, right? Higher education. Not one of them teaches samadhi. Some teach meditation, but in a kind of mechanical way. You follow a technique, you have a method, you repeat a mantra, you scan the body in certain ways. These are helpful tools at various levels, but they are not direct insight. So we are at a very critical phase of humanity, and we need then to have that yogic vision to deal with the challenge of the technology today. But we also need the yogic vision in terms of detachment, because that technology is not going to enlighten you or give you happiness, or even giving you proper health physically or psychologically, because it's trapped more in what we say a mechanical model. So Sri Aurobindo also, if you read his work, he covers the topic from all sides. He doesn't just say it's that way. And in the process, he sets in motion for you a way of thinking and inquiry, so you can come to your own understanding of the truth involved, based on understanding whether it's the physical nature, the vital nature, the mental nature, or what is beyond. He makes that very clear and very direct. And he also has a great understanding of the power of devotion, surrender, or even what we call bhakti yoga. There's a metaphor I like to teach people, students or whoever. It's very simple. The mind is, if you have a gila, the mind is like the wick. Knowledge is the flame, but devotion is the ghee. If you don't have that, you just burn up the mind. So we have a lot of burned up minds. And in terms of artificial intelligence, it's a misnomer. You can have computer tools that can help you compute, they can help you edit, manage, organize, but they can't think for you, they can't have original thoughts, and they can't guide humanity forward, and they cannot make independent decisions. And as Sri Aurobindo also teaches, all the yoga teaches, whatever you give your main power of attention to, you tend to become that. So if you're meditating on one thing, you become that. If you spend all your time looking at a computer or a screen, you become a computer or a screen. The yogis would go in the forest academy out into nature. You become nature. So a lot is being lost. Certain understandings are coming in. India has a greater role, and also Sri Aurobindo's teachings have a greater role, but all the related Vedic mantra teachings. For example, let's take something like Ayurveda. Modern medicine is built upon chemistry, right? We know that very well. But the traditional healing is based upon prana. How can you have healing and well-being without understanding, balancing, and developing prana and related forces? Psychology is becoming more now psychiatry and giving people certain designer drugs to get rid of depression, anxiety, or whatever else they have. But the only thing that heals the mind is conscious awareness. It can't be healed simply by a chemical. And then if you have a chemical, that means there's no person there. There's just a machine. And then, of course, there's the challenge to society and relationship and goal of life. what is the goal of your life? If the goal of our life is only the outer, then you eventually get bored, you eventually get limited, and you eventually have to let that go. But if you develop an inner awareness, you can discover there's as much space, time, whatever, inside as there is outside. Again, we have this idea, Dharakaasha, the small space within the heart that holds the entire universe, all time, all space, all locus are there. So Sri Aurobindo reintroduces to us that what we would call the cosmic vision, not simply a social vision, a political vision, scientific vision, chemical vision, and all the things that tend to go on today. So he gives us the tools, but applying them takes effort. You are in a special place where that heritage is there, it's pervading the environment from these great gurus who have lived here. And there are also, of course, challenges that go along with that, and also many resources that can be discovered. And the difficulty of discovering an inner connection to the divine, not simply an outer one. And also, again, to link up to that Yoga Shakti force, which again is like an electrical energy, it can take you to a higher level of inner functional activity, and also understanding the teachings. It's one thing to read the teachings, it's another thing to understand and be able to practically, you work with them and manifest them. And as Sri Aurobindo also said, all life is yoga. So there's a yogic way to do everything. There's a yogic way to be an artist. There's also a non-yogic way to be an artist. And now we could also we have people who are writing music who have never played a musical instrument, but they can manipulate the computer to produce some sort of music through that, same with painting, and all of that. So that yogic way of applying whatever you do with a higher awareness, intention, consciousness, calm, and goal to raise the level of consciousness, not just simply to produce a commodity that the material world is going to value and give you credit for, but moving more into the formless realms. And that's why Sri Aurobindo's teaching is difficult. He does not give a technique. He does not give a formula. Each person, he says, has to be treated differently according to their karma, their dharma, their samskaras, and so forth. And also according to the influences in the environment, the teachers involved. Because it's not something that can be mass-produced. So we see we are in this very challenging times. But it also means that the more we create the channels, and the Shakti has a channel, the more you create that channel, then that channel will also grow and develop and expand. The more you create that inner learning, then that can also become your dominant samskara. And also we say your dominant sankalpa, what is your prime motivation in life? What is your prime thought? Everybody meditates, but for some people the meditation is, I want this, I want that, woe is me, I didn't get that. That is your primary thought. We need to develop that deeper intention. And he also talks about, we have these two ways. One, of course, is the self-inquiry, the Atma-vichara, and the other is the surrender, the Ishvara pranidhana. And so it's very simple. You were able to turn within, and you, by that shift of the movement of consciousness, then you can link into these higher consciousness forces, and then access the higher Prakriti and the higher Shakti that brings out a whole new set of potentials that do have the power to change the body and the mind, but they require the focus and the attention and the dedication to do so. They can't just be a Saturday activity or a hobby or something you do at a social gathering or when you visit a temple. And I have to also say that in the Indian context, a certain vastu was created in these areas. That's the temples were also for that, to develop a certain sacred space. Even the temple is said to be a replica of the universe as a whole. And also this whole idea of creation of a higher type of time, sacred space, space of awareness, time, consciousness. Then you're not limited by these outer parameters, and something you could say magical can happen, and you can then discover, even in sometimes a simple thing like a flower, you could discover a divine presence, and you learn how to see these sacred energies and work with them within and around you, creative energies, transformative energies. And the good thing about Sri Aurobindo too, he's left such a wealth of teachings and resources, from his letters on yoga to his Life Divine, and synthesis of yoga, that there is some point of entry that you can discover, and then from there various other things can open, or even gateways to other teachings in Upanishads, Gita, Vedas, yoga, Tantra, and understanding how these forces pervade. So it's a very critical situation, but unless the world adapts to this yoga and brings out a yoga that's not mechanical, but that is based upon a deeper surrender, a deeper insight, then we have a way forward. Otherwise, we're going to be trapped in the net of our own mental thought and the machines that we produce. The fact is, we will eventually transcend. There's no doubt about that. The problem is it going to be a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, or even some centuries? And this is also, Sri Aurobindo had a great knowledge of earlier humanities. There have been previous humanities before us that did not survive, that did not move on properly. He's also mentioned that as well. There are also those that have. So a new humanity is also required. But that's the vision of the rishi, the yogi, not necessarily, it's not against the scientist. But the model to follow is not simply scientists, because the scientists has changed the outside, but they haven't changed the inside. So we need the new rishi, the new yogi, and Sri Aurobindo has given us a lot of the resources to move into that and to bring that out. And here you have a community. The more you have the common aspiration, then the more you are able to share and increase that energy in your lives and in the common work that you do. So with those words, I will close whatever talk I have, but I'm happy to address whatever questions, comments you have.
Sri Aurobindo, in one of his aphorisms, says, break the forms of the past,
Yes.
but keep its spirit and genius alive,
Yes.
without which there is no future.
Yes. Very beautiful statement.
I have a double-edged question on this. One, when we look towards India, the civilizational change that you referred to, which we are undergoing right now, are we sticking too much to the form? That's the first question.
Are we taking too much of the form?
To the form.
Yes.
Yes, we are certainly going back to the past, but are we limiting ourselves to the form?
Mm-hmm.
And second is, because you live in the Western world, although this idea has not really caught up overwhelmingly, is there a clear beginning of this as an idea that you witnessed there?
Yes. Well, first of all, relative to the too much of the form, you have to. What's important is, of course, to have the creative energy. the creative energy does produce forms, and certain forms are necessary. I, for one, also think that temples are very important. In fact, next week we're going to Aurobindo for the opening of the Hindu temple there through the Swami Narayan movement, which is being endorsed by the royal family there. This is a fact. They came to the there. So I don't think there's too much emphasis on the form, but I think the form always has to be adapted and used. Even take whether it's from Mahabharata or Ramayana, you have to understand it in a living way. And they were not meant to be just historical studies or whatever. We do see in all the countries of the world, there are some groups that have taken up something yogic, something meditative. We found a lot of that actually in countries like Russia, Brazil. They're not a majority, but almost every country has a group that is doing that to some degree. They don't always have a clear view or complete guidance, but there is a movement there as well, and we have to support that. And also nature itself has certain energies coming in that you can also feel and experience. So it's important to maintain a positive attitude, but we also have to be discerning as we go and understand practical things. I'll give you something very simple. We look at screens and we look at cell phones. You lose your depth perception. You're only looking at a box. And then the mind starts to function like a box. So I always tell people, go out at night and look at the stars. I don't know whether you can see them here. Restore your depth perception or meditate upon the vastness of space so that we maintain a deeper, nuanced view. You'll notice today there's so many groups that it's black and white, the good guys versus the bad guys, or whoever else it may be, rather than looking at the broader issues involved.
Specifically talking about Indic civilization, do you think that religion and spirituality are two separate entities?
Well, you have to understand that religion is a Western word. And if you go back to religion in the West, the ideal form of religion is monotheism. That is what it came out of.
So, but if you don't take that context and take the religion as we experience or as we have in India,
yes.
Do you think these two are, because a lot of this there is I'm not religious but I'm spiritual,
yes.
Or I'm spiritual
yes.
but I'm not religious.
Yes.
So is this making any sense in India?
Well, it makes sense everywhere that you want the spiritual experience, not simply a religious belief. Belief can be comforting, but you're not changed inwardly. Higher consciousness. So, in some of these religions, they don't have a sadhana base. The Indic traditions are sadhana meditation based. You have to develop a sadhana to realize the truth for yourself. It's not just a matter of salvation by proxy. You take on a belief, you will be saved, something will happen to you. You don't need to worry about things for the future. And it's very important we free ourselves from some of these misleading terms. The reason why I say that is often there's an attempt to look at Indic traditions in the light of Western philosophical, scientific, psychological values. In fact, if you look at Hindu studies in the West, there are two dominant gurus they follow. One is Freud, the other is Marx. Neither of which has anything to do with the traditions or any understanding, because they're working out of their own intellectual tradition. So we have to have the experiential part of spirituality. Now, even the term spirituality is a term that you have to understand. I know people who say, I'm spiritual and I'm a Jehovah's Witness and other things like that. I'm not, again, trying to criticize anyone. But in the Indian sense, we use the term adhyatma, relating to the inner self. Whereas the religious beliefs tend to relate to some outer identity. I joined this group, I'm part of this movement, I change my name, I make a donation, and then that is what we do. So there's the science of spirituality, which is the inner science, and the way of direct perception. That is what we need to follow. That is not simply India. It's India has fostered that more, but that is the way of anyone who is trying to have a direct perception, whether at a mystical level or scientific level or artistic level. We need to go back to that experiential factor, and we need to teach the children how to experience consciousness, starting in nature, because otherwise they become addicted to the machine, and then the machine has its own agenda.
One example you gave about the oil and the wick and the flame. Can you please repeat? Can you please repeat that example?
Yeah, I said the mind is like the wick. Knowledge is the flame, but devotion is the ghee or the oil. If you just light the wick, you're going to burn it up. So often the intellect gets burned up by this outer knowledge, or it loses its creativity or spiritual focus. You remember in Indian, particularly among certain groups, the term bhakt was a term of derision. This is a bhakt, which means he's a mindless devotee. But the fact is, you need more of that devotional knowledge in the higher sense to connect to divine reality. Because it's something that we have an inner connection to, but it's not something we can control. And here you have this distinction between the Western civilization and the Indian civilization. Indian civilization, the image has been Shiva, Buddha, we have the Pashupati in the older forms, the yogi. Whereas in the Western tradition, the thinker, he's more the power of the human brain. And so there's not that sense of a higher consciousness. For example, in Western psychology, there's no concept of samadhi or even Atman. There's only a consciousness of the brain, of biological urges, social influences, and all of that. So we need to cultivate that devotional, and as Sri Aurobindo says, also aspiration. What is your aspiration? And what is your dedication? That is required, not just simply choosing something or following something.
I have an observation to make. I have grown partly up in the West, and what I found then was that the approach, especially education, was very pragmatic, very rational. Now to break that mindset, to imbibe spirituality, how do you see the West is going to cope with that problem?
Well, first of all, let's look at the different way the mind the intellect is looked at. Now in the West, there's this cultivation of reason, right? But reason does not give knowledge. Reason is a way of organizing knowledge. So the Western mind regards these pramana, or means of knowledge, as the senses, and extensions of the senses, telescopes, microscopes, whatever machines there are, to produce evidence. Then reason organizes the evidence and tries to find what is behind it. But what we call evidence is something on the outside. It's okay, it helps you understand what is on the outside. But what is the evidence for you? You don't have to ask that question, you are your own evidence, at least you. So, in the West, there is that orientation of the mind outward. Now, in the yoga system, it's always that place of viveka, discerning between the eternal and the transient, the real and the unreal, the light and the dark, the self and the not self. Their reason is turned around. It's reason is used, but then it's used at that experiential level, and your experience is through your meditation. You know, in Upanishads, as Sri Aurobindo used to say, when the rishis get together and have a discussion, they ask, what have you seen or what have you realized now? What evidence you have produced in your particular experiment. So what's happened in the West is that we are pushing the limits of information. You can have more and more information, but at a certain level, it begins to block you because you're not seeing or knowing. And what's happened is you see there's been a lot of decline relative to art and creativity, and the mechanical factors have come up. But in that, the human being gets lost. The human being is not a mechanical factor. And then we have the predominance of social political factors over internal factors. The West is undergoing that crisis. It's interesting though, we found that at a university level, the medical groups, for example, we did some programs with the Harvard Medical School, they were willing to bring in some aspects of yoga and Aurobindo. And in the physicists' realm, they were willing to consider, they're still considering the idea of some sort of universal consciousness. It's not the transcendent thing we think of, it's often something very basic, but they are willing to consider that. But at the level of the humanities, we're trying to understand things relative to social behavior rather than relative to the individual aspiration. And that's one of the reasons why the educational system is suffering. In fact, now we have this situation that we're allowing certain groups to develop their own mathematics. If you believe that 2 plus 2 is 6, that's fine. You can have your own mathematics, maybe it causes you some trouble in calculation. But the idea of some overriding singular truth they have moved away from. And then they move to see, they don't have that concept of Atma or universal consciousness. Again, the idea is you're a physical being, how do we best adapt to your behavior? How do we, what is the best drug we can give you? What is the best surgery we can do for you? These things have their place, but they don't connect us up that way. And at a certain level, for example, they weaken the immune system, and then you have more health problems. There's an epidemic of depression in the Western world, even in the more affluent regions. And it's very simple. If you're always getting stimulated from the outside, you're going to get depressed, because the stimulation will eventually go down, or become limited, or become old. So we need that renewal of perception and awareness. It's not a matter of simply religion, it's also a matter of connecting to nature, life, and the forces of consciousness. We live in a self-aware universe. We don't just live in a mechanically created structure.
Maybe we can take 2 more quick questions if anybody has, because we don't want to tire him too much. Okay, I just have a very small question. In the evolution of civilization, like of India, it's also the evolution of its consciousness. When it is evolving, it has reached a certain level. What actually could really stop it for a period of time? And it's only now that we are coming back again to the path.
Well, what happened is India, of course, suffered from a lot of foreign invasions. And also, there was a kind of, you say, civilizational hostility. You know, when one power comes in, let's take, I'll just put this in the historical context. If you look at how India was perceived in the Greco-Roman era, it was considered to be very wealthy, very affluent, very full of sages, all of that. Even into the 18th century, you had figures like Voltaire quoting the greatness of India, the greatness of France. When the British came in, they, in order to justify ruling India, they had to pretend India had no civilization, and they were making India civilized, even though they were taking all the wealth of the country and borrowing other things along as well. So there was that undermining of the educational system and other factors. And then under the Nehruvian era, it was still more of the socialist Western model. And you can also see how he economically failed, because you need the creativity. So he created the Hindu rate of growth to explain why he couldn't get the economy moving upwards. And then now what we have today is there's a certain jealousy that has come up. In the United States, the Indians, specifically the Hindus, are perhaps, or at least close to, the most affluent and educated and prominent minority group. So it's actually come out by the people on the left. This is what they actually say today. Hindus are white people in brown bodies. And they yeah, so they have the same values because they're able to be successful. So they should be restricted in quotas. In other words, for example, right now, this is also in the United States, at a university level, whites are a minority. I think they cover maybe 20% of the people in the universities. Blacks are twice the amount. Asians, there's lots of them, but now they're restricting the number of Asians that come in because they're able to be successful. So that challenge is there. And there's also now, of course, the overall greater popularity of yoga and spirituality throughout the world. In a positive sense, there's also commercialization of that to some degree as well. And so we see that it's civilizationally in the world, we've lost the kind of, you might say, transcendent values. Human being wants something transcendent beyond death, sorrow, and all the other things. Not that we don't want to live in a world of beauty and all of that. And so that's why people feel empty. Because how many movies can you watch? How many drugs can you take? How much travel you can do or whatever else? I'm not saying these things may not have their particular place. But that seeking of the transcendent is what you have coming out of the Indian tradition, but in a practical way, not just as something, high in the sky that you can never reach, but a way of being part of a greater universal vision.
Do you think intolerance is rising in India?
Intolerance is rising in India.
In terms of also revising history and...
Yes, that's a very good question, revising history. Well, first of all, you have to recognize that the Indian civilization is the most tolerant, and it's most tolerant because of the Hindus. People say, well, India is becoming intolerant or it's losing its democracy. What democracy is there around India? Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, whatever else there is. That is a misstatement. What we need and what is necessary is equal rights. I'll give you an example. The history books coming out of India, who wrote them? Marxists. Lilith Thapar, Irfan Habib, etc. And there's nothing Hindu there.
Yeah.
Hindu, they say there's no Hindu, there's no India. Ramayana's mythology, somebody made Krishna up, and they glorify Mughals. If you go to Delhi, all the streets are named after Mughals. You don't find too many. In fact, they finally gave Aurobindo a little place somewhere. So I think that is an intolerance. Who's intolerant? For example, Hindus aren't trying to convert the world, but you have a multi-billion-dollar conversion business that is from both the Islamic and the Christian side that's long been targeting India at various levels, whether it's evangelicals, whether it is so many groups. So it's not a question of tolerance, it's a question of needing equal rights. In India, you have the temples are controlled by the state, regulated by the state, and the money is taken away by the state governments, whereas Christians and Muslims don't have that. India is the only country in the world in which its majority religion is taken by the government and used for mundane purposes. And yet Hindus are said to be intolerant if they question the process. Even in your textbooks, Shivaji is hardly mentioned. And yet we have, again, glorification of the very forces that attacked or destroyed the temples and all of that in India. Even on something like these temples like Krishna Janmabhoomi. It's all in the history books. The British saw it, Europeans saw it, Aurangzeb said, I did it, and yet people are saying, oh, they didn't do it, Hindus are making that up. So I think that that's still in the shadow of the colonialism. And you have to remember too that it's not a question of one belief or another, it's also a question of honoring a tradition. And there are also those who would say negative things about Sri Aurobindo. In fact, others have even, I remember I wrote something positive about him, and some Western, I don't know what he was, leftist, said that Sri Aurobindo was a notorious violent revolutionary who later on pretended to be a yogi.
That's the lack of knowledge.
David, thank you for this superb, insightful talk. Very grateful for sharing all this with us, the wisdom, and thank you.
But there's always things we can do, and we should never think that we will be overwhelmed. But we do have to take the situation seriously, and we also have to have our own sadhana and nurture it and help it.